The wind howled through the narrow streets of Hereford, carrying with it the whispers of ambition, envy, and fear. Born into a modest, noble family in 1286, Edmund Draven had inherited more than his father's title. He had inherited a calculating mind and a relentless hunger for power. His early years were unremarkable to the untrained eye, but in the shadows of courtly intrigue, he observed carefully, learning the subtle movements of men who wielded authority and the hidden fractures within England's political tapestry. Edmund's father, a seasoned courtier, had taught him the value of patience, the sharpness of law, and the subtle art of persuasion. Unlike his contemporaries who flaunted wealth and influence to intimidate rivals, Edmund studied strategy, manipulating alliances, and sowing discord quietly. When Edward II ascended to the throne after his father's death in 1307, the kingdom was vulnerable. The young king's preference for companionship over counsel left a vacuum of power, a vacuum that Edmund was determined to fill. His first steps were deliberate. He cultivated relationships with key officials, learning the inner workings of administration while simultaneously observing the weaknesses of the nobility. Where others sought gold and titles, Edmund sought influence, the unseen force that allowed a man to command even kings. He did not rush, for he understood the deadly lesson of overreach from those who came before. Ambition unchecked could either elevate a man to glory or obliterate him entirely. By 1318, Edmund's position at court had solidified. He had become the confidant of Edward II, present in chambers where the king made decisions, subtly guiding choices without ever seeming overbearing. Whispers in the corridors called him the king's shadow, a figure more powerful than his modest birth would suggest. Yet he was not a tyrant yet. His cruelty was measured, his ambition masked behind courteous words and feigned humility. The seeds of fear had been planted, however. Nobles whose lands had been encroached upon or whose influence had waned began to murmur in private. Edmund watched these murmurs, cataloging enemies and allies alike, preparing for the day when subtlety would no longer suffice. He knew that real power was not only in shaping the present, but in controlling the past, the future, and the perception of both. In the courts and castles of England, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would lift Edmund Draven from a noble shadow to the ruler in all but name. The corridors of power were silent, save for the whisper of silk and the faint clatter of armored feet. Edmund Draven's influence had grown like an invisible thread woven through the very fabric of the kingdom. By 1320, he was no longer merely the king's confidant. He had become the unseen hand guiding the fate of England. Lords and knights trembled not for their fear of the king, but for the shadow that lingered behind him. Edmund understood the language of power as one might read the shifting patterns of wind. He cultivated loyalists in every corner of the court, placing allies in judicial positions, offices of finance, and key councils. No edict was issued without his knowledge, no dispute resolved without his subtle persuasion. He wielded legality, like a weapon, turning the law itself into an instrument of intimidation. Those who opposed him faced accusations of treachery, charges fabricated to strip them of lands, titles, and dignity. In the Marcher lands near Wales, where semi-autonomous lords held sway, Edmund's ambitions became even bolder. He orchestrated minor conflicts, providing just enough chaos for him to intervene as a savior, seizing territories under the guise of royal mandate. Each maneuver was meticulously documented, ensuring that even the harshest critics could find no legal grounds to challenge his encroachments. Wealth and influence flowed into his hands like a river he had dammed for his own use. But power is never absolute, and envy is a constant shadow. Queen Isabella, the French-born consort of Edward II, felt the tightening grip of Edmund's dominion. He had systematically limited her access to her husband, drained her household of resources, and belittled her influence in matters of state. Rumors of secret alliances began to circulate, whispers carried in the chill winds to the queen's ears. She was no stranger to intrigue, and quickly began to plot a course that could disrupt Edmund's carefully spun web. Edmund, ever vigilant, anticipated resistance, but underestimated Isabella's resolve. The Queen's journey to France in 1325 was ostensibly diplomatic, but it provided her the freedom to rally exiled nobles and loyalists, who had fled Edmund's purges. Together with Roger Mortimer, a marcher lord who had evaded Edmund's grasp, Isabella began constructing a coalition of disaffected lords, merchants, and soldiers. Through subtle propaganda and promises of justice, she cast Edmund as the corrupt manipulator, a foreign poison within the heart of English governance, despite his native birth. By the time she returned to England with an armed force in 1326, the kingdom was primed for upheaval. Peasants, tired of the extortion and cruelty under Edmund's shadow, flocked to her banner. Nobles who had once bowed in fear now weighed the tides of fortune, many abandoning the king and his favorite to secure their own survival. Edmund's network of fear, meticulously built over a decade, began to unravel like fine silk caught in the wind. In the quiet moments before confrontation, Edmund surveyed the lands he had claimed, the castles he had fortified, and the alliances he had forged. The web of influence he had so carefully spun was beginning to snap. He realized that power rooted in fear could not withstand the united will of those it oppressed. The storm was coming, and even his cold intellect could not fully prepare him for the reckoning that awaited. The air in France was thick with anticipation and secrecy. Queen Isabella, no longer the passive consort of a distracted king, had transformed into a strategist of unparalleled cunning. Every decision she made was precise, every word calculated to inspire loyalty and provoke action. The exiled nobles who had suffered under Edmund Draven's relentless grip now looked to her as both shield and spear, a symbol of hope that the shadow over England could finally be lifted. Isabella's meeting with Roger Mortimer in the secluded forest glade was a masterclass in subtle diplomacy. She exuded authority far beyond what her title might suggest, her gaze steady and commanding, her voice soft yet unwavering as she outlined the plan to invade England. Mortimer, once a cautious lord, was inspired by her resolve, ready to commit his forces to her cause. The coalition grew in strength and numbers, each supporter a fragment of the fractured kingdom longing for justice. Meanwhile, Edmund remained unaware of the full scope of the Queen's actions. His spies whispered of movements in France of exiled nobles gathering under a banner he could not yet see. He relied too heavily on fear and reputation, assuming that terror alone would suppress resistance. Yet Isabella's campaign was not built on fear. It was built on trust, loyalty, and shared grievances. The contrast was stark, and Edmund's empire of shadows began to feel the first cracks. Letters and emissaries crisscrossed the channel under cover of night, bringing promises of support, arms, and intelligence to the Queen's growing army. Each detail was meticulously logged and coordinated, ensuring that when the time came, their landing in Essex would be both swift and overwhelmingly symbolic. The people of England, long suffering under heavy taxes, arbitrary arrests, and the terror of Edmund's personal enforcers, would see in Isabella's arrival the embodiment of justice and restoration. Back in England, Edmund fortified his positions along the Welsh marches, unaware that the tides of loyalty were shifting. Peasants and townsfolk, once fearful of retribution, now secretly aided those opposed to him, guiding messengers, providing shelter, and quietly undermining his authority. Edmund's careful networks were starting to unravel, and the chilling sense of invincibility that had defined his rule was beginning to erode. The Queen's propaganda was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective. She portrayed Edmund as the corrupt manipulator of the crown, a threat to both law and tradition. The tales of his exploitation of nobles, harassment of women, and assaults on the church traveled faster than the wind, galvanizing support for her cause. In every port, every town, whispers grew louder. The shadow that had loomed over England was being pierced by the light of Isabella's resolve. As the preparations reached their zenith, Edmund remained unaware of the storm approaching. From the east, his confidence, once absolute, now masked the tremors of fear that he refused to acknowledge. The threads of his carefully woven web were fraying, and when Isabella's forces finally crossed the channel, the first real challenge to his dominion would arrive not as a surprise, but as a reckoning long in the making. The English coastline quivered under the first chill of autumn, and the horizon seemed to whisper of change. Queen Isabella's fleet sailed quietly across the channel, each vessel a symbol of hope for the oppressed and a harbinger of dread for those who had thrived under Edmund Draven's iron grip. The waves glimmered in the fading sunlight as the ships, adorned with banners depicting the Queen's crest, approached Essex. Silence, punctuated only by the creaking of timbers and the muffled commands of sailors, veiled the coming storm. Within, the fleet, Isabella moved among her commanders, her long dark hair barely tamed by a simple braid, her expression a blend of regal composure and calculated anticipation. Mortimer, her right hand, ensured that every detail was accounted for. Troop placement, signaling methods, and the coordination of townsfolk who would rise at their arrival. Isabella's mind was a chessboard, each move deliberate, anticipating every countermove Edmund might attempt. Meanwhile, Edmund's stronghold in the Welsh marches buzzed with false confidence. Reports from scouts hinted at foreign movements along the coast, but he dismissed them as minor disturbances, unaware of the scale of Isabella's preparation. Inside his fortified hall, he convened a council, surrounded by loyalists who, though outwardly obedient, secretly questioned the strength of his dominion. Edmund's sharp eyes scanned each face, reading hesitation, masking his own growing unease. The foundation of fear upon which he had built his empire now wavered. On land, as Isabella's forces approached the Essex shores, townsfolk began to quietly prepare. Hidden from Edmund's watchful enforcers, men and women erected barricades, guided horses into safe zones, and signaled to the approaching fleet with lanterns. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmurs of resistance like sparks ready to ignite. Edmund's spies, once the threads that wove his intricate web of control, reported nothing of consequence. The Queen's operation was a masterstroke of deception and coordination. The first ships made landfall at dusk. As oars struck sand, the banners fluttered, catching the dim twilight in a cascade of gold and crimson. Peasants emerged from hiding, offering assistance, guiding soldiers past hidden traps, and silently undermining the defenses that Edmund's men had relied upon for years. The psychological impact of seeing the people rise in unison with Isabella's forces sent a ripple of fear through the loyalist ranks, exposing cracks in the facade of Edmund's authority. Edmund, finally alerted to the invasion, rode hurriedly toward Essex with a small retinue, his cloak flapping in the wind, black hair flying as he surveyed the approaching tide of forces. Yet even as he rode, he realized too late that his network of fear had failed. Loyalty bought through terror was fragile, and the storm that now descended upon him was fueled by the collective will of those he had oppressed. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, the tide had turned. As night fell, the clash seemed imminent. Lanterns flickered across the coast, shadows of soldiers and townsfolk merging in a dance of strategy and courage. Edmund's mind raced, recalculating every possible defense, but the momentum of Isabella's meticulously planned operation carried forward with unstoppable force. The kingdom he had ruled from the shadows was now the stage for his reckoning. For the first time in a decade, Edmund understood that power, when rooted solely in fear, could crumble beneath the united resolve of those who dared resist. Dawn broke over Essex with a brittle chill, mist curling along the marshes and clinging to the rooftops of the town. Queen Isabella's forces, now fully ashore, spread into the streets with careful precision. Soldiers moved silently through alleys, guided by townsfolk who had grown bold under the promise of liberation. The air was heavy with both anticipation and the pungent scent of oil lamps and damp earth. Every footstep, every whispered command, carried the weight of decades of fear and oppression, now giving way to rebellion. In the center of the town, Isabella stood on the balcony of a stone manor, surveying her forces with an intensity that seemed to draw the light itself. Her long black hair shimmered in the pale morning sun, eyes cold yet commanding. Mortimer approached, whispering updates and concerns. The Queen's presence was magnetic, and her mere gaze seemed to galvanize both seasoned soldiers and hesitant townsfolk alike. Every detail of the siege had been anticipated, every obstacle accounted for, yet Isabella remained vigilant, knowing that even the slightest miscalculation could spell disaster. Edmund Draven, meanwhile, had fortified the surrounding hills and marshes, bringing forth his remaining loyalists in a desperate attempt to halt the Queen's advance. His forces were fewer than expected, The web of fear he had relied upon to maintain control had begun to unravel. Peasants once intimidated into submission now quietly sabotaged supply lines, blocked paths, and reported troop movements to Isabella's commanders. Edmund's authority, so long absolute, was now fragile and contested. The siege itself unfolded like a grim ballet. Archers took positions on rooftops and walls, their arrows raining with lethal precision upon the approaching loyalists of Edmund. Siege engines, secretly assembled under the cover of night, toppled barricades and gates with thunderous impact. In the chaos, Isabella remained a figure of poise and strategy, issuing orders that seemed simultaneously fluid and unyielding. The clash of wood, iron, and the cries of men and horses filled the air, but her voice cut through it all, calm and decisive. Amidst the turmoil, small acts of defiance became crucial turning points. A group of townsfolk set fire to supplies loyal to Edmund, while others guided Isabella's soldiers to weak points in the enemy's defense. Every action, every sacrifice, was a testament to the growing power of collective resolve. Edmund's forces, disoriented and demoralized, struggled to maintain cohesion. Shadows of panic began to creep into the faces of men who had once believed themselves invincible. By mid-afternoon, the town had been largely secured. Edmund, seeing the futility of resistance, retreated to the hills, but the psychological blow had already been dealt. His aura of invulnerability shattered. Whispers of his impending downfall spread rapidly. Isabella's forces had achieved more than a military victory. They had delivered a moral and symbolic triumph, demonstrating that oppressive power, no matter how entrenched, could be dismantled by courage, cunning, and unity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Isabella walked among her soldiers and the liberated townsfolk. Her gaze softened briefly as she acknowledged the sacrifices made. But her sharp features never lost their commanding edge. The siege of Essex would be remembered not merely as a tactical victory, but as the turning point where the shadow of tyranny began to crumble, and the promise of a new era of justice and governance emerged from the mists of fear and oppression. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the Welsh hills, wrapping the landscape in a ghostly veil. Edmund Draven's forces had regrouped, desperate and disheartened, while Queen Isabella's army pressed forward with relentless precision. The clash, that had been brewing for weeks now, demanded resolution. Every horsehoof on the muddy path, every soldier's breath, echoed with the weight of impending fate. The air was thick with tension, a prelude to the storm that history would remember. On a hill overlooking a narrow valley, Edmund watched Isabella's troops advance. His cloak, once the symbol of supreme authority, hung heavily on his shoulders, damp with morning dew and fear alike. For years, he had ruled through terror and manipulation, confident that no one could challenge his dominion. Yet, now, as Isabella approached with the quiet certainty of a ruler born for command, he sensed the crumbling of his carefully constructed world. The shadow of inevitability fell upon him like the first strike of a blade. Isabella, riding at the forefront of her forces, was the very embodiment of strategic mastery. Her long black hair, caught in a light morning breeze, framed a face that radiated calm determination. Mortimer rode beside her, eyes scanning for threats, while scouts whispered updates that she absorbed without a flicker of hesitation. Every movement, every calculated pause, revealed her mastery of both battlefield and morale. The soldiers, inspired by her presence, moved with a synchronized discipline, their unity a stark contrast to Edmund's fragmented lines. The valley became a theater of psychological warfare as much as physical confrontation. Isabella ordered her archers to position on the high ridges, creating overlapping fields of fire. Edmund, recognizing the peril, attempted to rally his commanders, but the fear that had sustained his rule betrayed them. Peasants, emboldened by the Queen's advance, emerged from hiding to sabotage supply lines and flank Edmund's forces. His men, long accustomed to fear-driven obedience, now faced a coalition of determined citizens and disciplined soldiers, their morale dissolving under the relentless tide. Skirmishes erupted across the valley, with arrows slicing through mist-laden air and steel clashing with steel. Edmund fought personally, a desperate attempt to inspire loyalty through valor. His black hair matted with sweat, face contorted with anger, he swung his sword against soldiers whose hearts were already won by Isabella's cause. Yet every blow he landed failed to shift the momentum. Every cry of defiance from the townsfolk and rebels chipped away at the myth of invincibility he had so carefully cultivated. As noon approached, Isabella maneuvered her forces to envelop the remaining defenders. Her strategy was flawless. One flank drew attention, while hidden contingents struck from behind, cutting off retreat and crushing resistance. The disciplined execution of her plan contrasted starkly with Edmund's growing desperation, highlighting the decay of tyranny when confronted by unity and intellect. Each skirmish, each tactical feint, further illustrated the collapse of a regime built solely on fear. By late afternoon, Edmund Draven's army had disintegrated. Those who had once feared retribution now fled in chaos, leaving him isolated on the battlefield. Isabella's gaze met his across the mud and blood, her expression unyielding, sharp with the promise of justice. The confrontation, long anticipated, ended not merely with defeat, but with the symbolic dismantling of his power. Edmund, the shadow ruler who had once bent England to his will, was now a figure of desperation, cornered by the very forces he had sought to dominate. The valley fell, silent except for the murmurs of victory and the anguished groans of the defeated. Isabella, mounted and resolute, walked among her troops, offering quiet acknowledgment of their courage while her eyes, cold and calculating, never left the figure of Edmund. The confrontation had not only decided the fate of a tyrant, but signaled the beginning of a new era, where cunning, strategy, and moral authority replaced terror as the true instruments of power. The smoke of battle still lingered over the valley, curling around the broken bodies and scattered weapons, when Edmund Draven finally realized that escape was no longer possible. The hills that had once given him strategic advantage now felt like a prison, the mists thickening around his disoriented troops. His black cloak, now torn and muddied, hung limply as despair replaced defiance. Every glance toward the advancing forces revealed an unyielding determination in Isabella's eyes, a promise that the reckoning had arrived. Isabella herself led the final advance, her presence radiating an unshakable authority. Her long black hair framed a face of cold precision, eyes calculating every movement of the remnants of Edmund's forces. Mortimer flanked her, coordinating the surrounding units to cut off any chance of retreat. Soldiers and townsfolk alike moved with a synchronized discipline that left no avenue unguarded. The very landscape seemed to bend beneath her will, as if the hills and valleys themselves conspired to aid her cause. Cornered in a narrow defile, Edmund attempted one last show of command. He shouted orders, waving his sword with authority, but the obedience he once commanded with terror had dissipated. Peasants, now emboldened by the Queen's victory, seized abandoned arms and harassed his flanks, while Isabella's archers rained arrows from the heights above. Every desperate maneuver only tightened the noose around him, and the shadow of inevitability loomed ever closer. Finally, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, Edmund fell back against a rocky outcrop, surrounded on all sides. Isabella dismounted, gracefully, her boots sinking into the mud, and advanced alone, her long black hair catching the light with an almost ethereal glow. There was no mercy in her expression, only the precise balance of justice and calculated wrath. The soldiers hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene, as the confrontation unfolded like a stage play designed by fate itself. Edmund, now a shadow of the formidable man he once was, tried to negotiate, his voice wavering, but Isabella's sharp eyes cut through his pleas. Every word of his former arrogance had been stripped away by the years of tyranny and fear that he had inflicted upon others. The Queen's voice, calm yet unyielding, pronounced the sentence: capture, humiliation, and confinement, until justice could be fully enacted. The symbolism was clear. Tyranny could be confronted, controlled, and finally contained. His capture was swift yet symbolic. The soldiers bound him with thick ropes, ensuring he could neither resist nor flee, while Isabella's scouts arranged the prisoners and confiscated the spoils of war. The valley, once a theater of chaos, became a stage for the calculated display of justice. Edmund's men were either incorporated into the Queen's forces, exiled, or left to face the consequences of their complicity. Every movement, every order, emphasized that power unearned through fear alone was fragile and impermanent. As the afternoon sun dappled the hillsides, Isabella oversaw the relocation of Edmund to a secure fortress. The journey itself was designed to reinforce the message of accountability. Along the route, townsfolk watched, murmuring among themselves, their faces a mixture of relief, vindication, and awe. Edmund's status, once untouchable, was now reduced to a man bound and powerless. The visual of his capture spread rapidly through the surrounding lands, a cautionary tale that reached far beyond the valley. By nightfall, Edmund Draven was confined, stripped of both authority and dignity. Isabella's camp remained vigilant, yet she allowed herself a brief moment to reflect. The conquest was not merely about defeating a tyrant, it was about restoring order, reinforcing justice, and demonstrating that leadership demanded more than fear. The capture had been executed with strategic brilliance, yet it also bore a psychological weight, a reminder that the powerful, when corrupted by absolute ambition, were ultimately subject to the judgment of those they had wronged. The events of the day would resonate for generations. Edmund's capture marked the final dismantling of his oppressive network and the restoration of agency to the people he had subjugated. Isabella's role, brilliant in both strategy and execution, solidified her place not just as a leader of armies, but as a symbol of calculated justice and the triumph of intellect over brute force. In the shadowed valley, where fear had once ruled, a new order emerged, tempered by mercy, precision, and the inexorable logic of consequence. The dawn broke with a chilling clarity over the fortress where Edmund Draven awaited his final judgment. The air was thick with anticipation, not just among the assembled guards and officials, but across the kingdom itself. Word of Edmund's capture had spread like wildfire, and the people, long oppressed under his tyranny, felt a cautious hope stirring in their hearts. The chamber where he was brought, austere and imposing, mirrored the gravity of the moment. Stone walls absorbed every echo, every whispered accusation, reinforcing the inexorable weight of justice about to be enacted. Queen Isabella entered the chamber with deliberate grace, her presence commanding absolute attention. Her long, black hair contrasted sharply with the muted stone background, while her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room with a quiet authority. Mortimer followed, his expression solemn but alert, ensuring that protocol and security were maintained. The once formidable tyrant Edmund knelt before them, his long black hair now tangled and damp, face etched with defeat and resignation. The contrast between ruler and captive could not have been more pronounced, a living tableau of power reversed. The proceedings were meticulous. Each of Edmund's crimes, treason, manipulation of the crown, persecution of nobles, desecration of law, and corruption of society, was read aloud, accompanied by witnesses and evidence meticulously collected during the campaign. Isabella's voice, steady and deliberate, narrated not only the offenses but the human cost of his ambition. Servants, soldiers, and nobles alike recalled the suffering they had endured, the fear that had pervaded their lives, and the destruction of their lands and livelihoods. Each account reinforced the lesson that unchecked ambition could devastate an entire kingdom. Following the testimony, Edmund was formally sentenced. Though his life would be spared from immediate execution, the punishment was designed to strip him of dignity, power, and influence completely. He was confined to solitary quarters within the fortress, cut off from communication, and required to relinquish all titles, lands, and privileges. The symbolic impact of this sentence was profound. The shadow of tyranny had been removed, and the restoration of lawful governance was underway. Isabella's measured approach contrasted sharply with the brutal excesses Edmund had once inflicted, demonstrating that justice could be both firm and principled. Outside the fortress, Isabella moved quickly to stabilize the kingdom. Loyal families who had suffered under Edmund's manipulations were restored to their former positions. Their estates and influence returned. Those who had collaborated with the tyrant were investigated, punished, or exiled according to their level of complicity. The reconstruction of administrative systems, alongside careful reconciliation with church authorities and influential nobles, reinforced the legitimacy of Isabella's rule and prevented a power vacuum from giving rise to new threats. The kingdom, though scarred by fear and oppression, began to heal under the steady hand of a ruler who understood both the use of power and its ethical limits. Diplomats and envoys from neighboring realms arrived to witness the aftermath, recording accounts of Edmund's downfall and the Queen's decisive leadership. His capture and trial became a reference point across Europe, a demonstration of the dangers inherent in unchecked favoritism and the corruption of absolute power. The lesson resonated beyond England. Authority demanded accountability, and rulers, who failed to govern with integrity, would eventually face the consequences. The psychological impact of Edmund's fall rippled through the consciousness of aristocrats and commoners alike, shaping perceptions of justice and governance for generations. As the sun set, Isabella stood upon the fortress battlements, surveying the land she had reclaimed. The scars of tyranny were visible, abandoned fortresses, ravaged fields, and towns still rebuilding, but there was also evidence of resilience, unity, and renewal. Her long black hair glistened in the fading light, sharp features illuminated by the golden glow, a silent testament to her triumph. Mortimer and advisors joined her, their presence underscoring the collaborative nature of power restored. In that moment, the kingdom exhaled, a collective breath of relief and cautious optimism. Justice had been served, tyranny dismantled, and the foundations for a more stable realm established. Edmund Draven, the shadow ruler whose ambition had nearly toppled England, became a cautionary tale, remembered not only for his cruelty, but for the remarkable clarity with which justice had ultimately prevailed.